Granted, we don't want mobster-style unions that crush small businesses, but we don't want corporate oligarchs that manipulate the marketplace either. One example detailed by tonight's guest, Saurabh Sharma, is the Texas legislature's Faustian bargain with Uber and Lyft. That deal, which overrode a decision by the Austin City Council, helped the rideshare companies avoid fingerprint testing for their drivers, a move meant to avoid sexual predators working as drivers and victimizing their passengers. And how did Lyft and Uber repay Texas Republicans for stepping in for them? By fighting tooth and nail against the recent fetal heartbeat bill that some have estimated will save as many as 50,000 lives a year. So joining me now to discuss is the president of American Moments, Saurabh Sharma himself. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me on, Kara.
Great. So tell me the details behind the Austin City Council's decision to mandate that ride-sharing companies make their drivers undergo fingerprint background checks, and then, of course, what happened next? Tell us.
Sure thing, Kara. Well, this story goes all the way back to December of 2015 when, because of a spate of sexual assaults that were happening inside ride-sharing apps across the country, there were a lot of city councils, both in the United States and internationally, that thought, well, maybe we should start applying the same rules that we do to taxi cab drivers as we do to these ride-sharing apps, namely fingerprinting all drivers. Now, whether or not that this would have actually helped make these apps more secure is an open question, but it's fully within, I think, Austin's rights to do something like this, and they did. Now, Uber and Lyft immediately went into a frenzy, spending as much money and time as possible in order to ensure this wouldn't be the case. Now, why? Because they thought it would damage their ability to recruit drivers. And so they managed to get a ballot proposition on the table in Austin, and the Austin people rejected that ballot proposition, 56-44, after Uber and Lyft spent $8 million trying to pass this. And ultimately, what Texas Republicans decided was that it was their responsibility to spend political capital and energy and the legislative time that the voters of Texas give them to go, quote unquote, fix this situation for the people of Austin. And so they passed a bill preempting all local ride-sharing regulations statewide, making it so that Uber and Lyft were able to essentially enshrine their business model into law.
So does it seem to you that all the time it seems like us Republicans, we're the ones out there and we're trying to make all these deals and we're trying to, help business, because that's what we always talk about, is that we want to be pro-business and pro-growth. But then unfortunately, that seems to always turn around and bite us, because it seems that it only really helps the tech oligarchies and some of these other big corporate America that's funding a lot of our even cultural divisions, whether it comes to race, gender, sexual education for children, and all this other heinous stuff. It seems like our morals sometimes are used against us, where when we see what's going on in some of these states, we see the Florida governor, for example, Ron DeSantis, he's doing a great job going after CRT and everything else, but then you'll hear a governor like Kristi Noem in South Dakota saying, well, no, you're going against the free market now and against the marketplace of ideals as well, and all this stuff. So what do you make of that debate that we're seeing growing, I guess, within the conservative movement itself, these two ways and modes of approaching the issue?
Right. I think there's two big divides that are breaking the right apart right now on a question like this. The first would be on, say, the substance of that very same bill that Texas ended up passing. There were conservatives at the time, even more libertarian-leaning conservatives, that said we shouldn't be writing Uber and Lyft, two very specific multi-billion-dollar companies' business practices into law, that there were cleaner versions of the bill that would have been more free market or pro-liberty on their own terms. That didn't end up happening because ultimately the way that the moderates within the Republican Party go along with even saying the word liberty or freedom at all is if it benefits their big business friends on Wall Street. Then you move on to the other level, which is that ultimately political capital, the amount of resources that politicians have in order to get something done, is limited. And so every decision they make on what they do with their time and energy is a choice. That's time that they could spend doing something else. So for every dollar and vote and measure of time that was spent passing this bill for Uber and Lyft, two multi-billion-dollar corporations that I've never really lost any sleep over, that was time not spent passing this heartbeat bill 6 years ago, or not spent advancing the Second Amendment, or not spent helping working families in Texas have an easier time. And so I think that a lot of social conservatives, and myself included, are really thinking through these days, is it worth it? Are these companies fair actors to cooperate with, to work with in American society, when they'll turn around and laugh at our cultural opinions and our social values the second they get a chance.
I know that's exactly right, and it's so strange because when I was a young Republican in high school and I would try and do my debates, it's funny the way we're talking now, back in those days I would say, oh, that sounds like socialism, and you're letting socialism, and that's it's just a cheap shot, and it's really not true. And unfortunately, look at the world that we're living in right now, big corporate America, you don't know where it ends and where big government begins these days. So when we're looking at it, do you think the way forward right now for conservatives such as yourself, American Moment, and others, the path forward is for populists and this wing of the conservative party and movement and ideology to really maybe reconcile with labor movements and to move forward in this positive direction?
I certainly hope so, Kara, because ultimately the choice in American life isn't between no labor or labor. Ultimately, it's Republicans can do everything they can in order to hurt unions, but ultimately a lot of the grievances that individual workers have will get addressed somehow. And so if it's not addressed by a small local union cooperating with the business owner in order to come to a mutually beneficial agreement, it's going to be the heavy hand of the federal government coming in and creating new rights in the strangest sense of the word, in every workplace, even when it may not be appropriate. That's how you get these byzantine bureaucracies across the country that are designed for workplace protection. It's because there aren't strong local unions that can come to the best solution that works for them. And so I frankly don't find myself that opposed to the concept of collective bargaining, the idea that workers and families should be able to come together to earn a good living for themselves. What I do oppose is the big union model under the NLRA and what has happened in the United States over the last 40 years, where they've essentially become apparatchiks of the Democratic Party. It is very strange that today the sector that's probably having the most union growth is not steel workers or coal workers. It's usually big media companies. It's the New York Times creating a union. It's Vox creating a union. It's BuzzFeed creating a union. These unions have essentially become a form of live action role play for upper middle class millennials in the knowledge class, when in reality they should be a tool to ensure broad middle class prosperity for the middle of this country.
So Rob, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me on, Kara.